Hello, and welcome to my show about multicultural communication. I'm glad you're here with me today because I want to talk about America and how we can live a better life. My name is Dr. Marquita Byrd, and my students call me Dr. B, so you may think of me as Dr. B. And what I'm trying to do with this lecture and this series of lectures is to, one, help us to come to understand the nature of American society. We have some sometimes outdated ideas about America, about the racial makeup, about rights. And I want us to understand who we are as a nation today and yesterday. Secondly, I'm hoping that you will acquire skills and knowledge that will help you to be a better citizen in a multicultural society. Not just a better citizen, but will allow you to learn to be able to enjoy being in a diverse society, to reduce some of the fear so that we can enjoy our time here. Life is tough. And what if I can do something to help us live our best life by talking about communication, then that's what I want to do. So today we're going to be talking specifically about culture. So very often we throw these words around: multicultural, interpersonal, uh, public speaking. Most people know what public speaking is, but don't know the rest of it. And so rather than gab on about these things that we may not all understand in the same way, then we'll talk about what they mean. Not because I think that you are not knowledgeable, but so that you and I can come to a common understanding about what we're talking about. So we're going to talk about culture today. What is culture? Culture is a very controversial term and means many things to many people. I would say specifically that culture is everything that people learn, everything that they produce, all the processes, the artifacts, the way of thinking. Culture, everything that we teach from the time we are born to the time we die to each other. Social mores, values, how relationships should be, how our families, all of that is learned through our culture. And let me point out that culture is very much shaped by the geography from which people come, the geography. There are books on cultural geography and also human geography. And these books talk to us about how where people live changes the culture. I'll just give you a very simple example. I came from the Midwest. I came from Missouri, which has some hills, Ozark Mountains, but basically much more flat. When you go into Nebraska and those sorts of things, very flat. So when I came to San Jose, wow, my perception of uh, the geography changed, and it changed the way I felt because I'm in a valley and surrounded by mountains. That changed how I looked at the weather every day. It changed how I looked at the grass every day. It changed how I perceived the water that we had available because of the geography. The geography was very, very different. So geography shapes our culture very, very much. People who live in a mountain area may see the deities that they live in the mountains. They may say, oh, they live at the top of the mountains. If you live on water, the people may experience Supreme Being as water. So the geography makes a great deal of difference. The space, for example. People in America live in great, vast spatial area, the continental U.S. So we have a lot of space. We used to have a lot of space. And so our attitudes about living, how much is too close and how much land we need, is very different from people who live on an island. You talk about Great Britain or Japan, very different notions of the use of space and housing. So the geography shapes our culture, and our traditions and the ways, things that we've had to do to survive, do it. So let's talk about what is the function of culture. Why, and we're talking about that. What's the function of it? The first thing let's think about it in terms of farming. I come from farming area. I grew up working in cotton fields, corn fields, chopping soybeans, working in the orchards in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And so I tend to think in terms of agricultural terminology. But when we get ready to plant, we cultivate the land. We cultivate it, meaning we prepare it, we turn it over so that it can aerate, and then we prepare it in order that the new crops that we plant may grow strong and survive. Cultivate. And that's what culture does. Culture prepares our babies so that they may grow strong and survive. Culture helps us to understand how we should talk to each other, how we should relate to each other, how we should feel about each other. One of the big areas of culture is worldview. Our culture tells us who we are in the universe. What is our worldview? Let me point out that every culture thinks that they are at the center of the universe. Sometimes people in Euro-Western cultures are criticized because we think we're the center of the universe, but most cultures think they're the center of the universe. Why? Because they can only see the universe from where they stand. We'll have a whole lecture on the standpoint theory. Our culture tells us who we are. They tell us who we are how? By the way they dress us. They tell us who we are by where we live. They tell us who we are by what kind of health care we can afford, our parents can afford. So society tells us who we are. That doesn't mean that our culture has to dictate it, but that's where we start from. Culture tells us about families and how families should work. In fact, families are the basic building block of every society. So how well the family is working is a big indicator of how the nation works. So that's why we have to take care of families. Culture is very important. One of the things that standardizes culture to some extent is public education. Public education, all of our children go there. They learn to read. They read the same stories. We get a common literature base. There used to be, when I was growing up, we had civic classes. So in the civic class, and we're talking about grade school, elementary, we learned how to be a good citizen. We learned about voting. We learned how to talk to people, how to respect people. And so school is a great standardizer, the public school system, and a purveyor of our culture. Much of what we see in our schools is very diverse now because, hey, we realize that our students are diverse. So our culture then teaches us about those things. When I first came to San Jose, I had never had a group of Asian students before. I'd never had Asian students. And so traditionally, sometimes Asian students are very quiet in class. And I know in the research, the scholars said that, well, it's because they don't have the same communication competencies or they don't speak English well. Well, I didn't accept that as face value because they weren't my students. So I talked to the students. I asked them, well, is there anything that I could do to help you to talk more in class? And then I talked to parents and I read. I found out that in Asian cultures, talking a lot may not be valued. Being quiet and being part of the group may be valued more. So my whole perception of my students changed. And I teach differently. I will call on more students to talk because they may not feel comfortable interacting. So our culture teaches us all about who we are, how to interact. I'll give you one more example. I am the first class of integration in the United States. My school system integrated in 1963. And integration was going on around the United States. I would say it was one of the greatest social experiments that we've had. But cultural differences occurred because in the African American community, when a child is talking to a grown up and they're being chastised, the child should look down at the ground and be very quiet and still and say, yes, ma'am. And that's considered respected. When we came into the system where we had European American teachers, they would chastise us and say, why aren't you looking at me when I'm talking to you? Well, because my culture says I'm being disrespectful to you as a grown-up. So we had to learn, okay, to look up and look at the teacher. And also the teachers had to learn what that meant when we weren't looking at them. So cultural differences can influence every single experience in every country, in every society. My first point was the function of culture, what it is, how it works, why it's important to understand it. My second point in this series is the political patterns of cultural relationships, not just in America, but in every country, but we're looking at America because that's where we are. But the patterns of the cultural relationships are very important because we tend to want to, we want to feel we're better than other people. We want to make distinctions among us. And so there always politics is involved in the way various cultural groups are responded to in the United States. For example, we've been seeing an upheaval since the early 70s in terms of how women as a cultural group are changing the United States because we were in a cultural pattern where women were subjugated. In fact, let's talk about wife, the word wife. In the medieval times, wife meant chattel. A man's wife was part of everything that he owned, along with the servants and the kids. She was property. And that notion came forward even into the 1700s, 1800s. I own you. You're supposed to do what I say, no matter I am, where I'm in the family or at the corporate setting. You're supposed to be subservient. And women started saying in the 1920s, I don't think so. That's not going to work. And so we began to take measures to change the political power between men and women as people coming from different cultures. Many people say that women grow up in a different space than men. We're changing that somewhat, but I use this example with my kids. In your house, where is the space for mom? The space for mom is in the kitchen. Her space is in the front room. Her space is in the bedroom. The closets particularly, she has more space than dad. So she has specific spaces. And I asked, where is dad's space? Dad's space is in the garage, on the lawn, and in the den. And so we tend to live in different spaces based on gender. And I extend that to my young people in my interpersonal classes to talk about the fact from interviews that I've done with men, many men say, I don't feel at home in my house. And they say they don't feel at home. Here's another cultural difference, because nothing reflects me. It's all about my wife and what she wants in the house. And so I talk to my young ladies about the fact that men live there too, and that they should be able to decorate and make some decoration decisions. One man said he felt like he was living in a dollhouse because the curtains were all fluffy and ruffled and very light colors. And I talk about the fact that we need to be egalitarian in how we even design our houses so that everybody feels comfortable in that cultural space and in that physical space. But there's always a struggle. When we come into contact with people who are of different cultures, here's the first thing that happens. We tend to get fearful. Oh, they look different from us. They sound different from us. What are we going to do about that? Number two, we have the move to subjugate them and to take control of the resources that they have. That's what happened between men and women. In a very masculine society, it was about what kind of resources can the woman bring to me, and how will I marshal her or be in control of her in order to get those resources. And we see, of course, with racial groups, we see it with different ethnic groups, we see it with different political groups. For example, in the workplace, people who are poor tend to get treated differently than people who are middle class or who have money. And we tend to think of the poor and uneducated as the foot soldiers, and we don't give them the good working conditions. They don't get the pay, etc., and so forth, because they're at the bottom. So basically, in every country, we're talking about point two, the relationships between different cultures. There is a hierarchy. A hierarchy is how we put people in a group from top to bottom. And this is something that is a natural human. This is a natural human characteristics. We say what's most important to least important. So we stack people like that. Who's at the top? Who's going to be at the bottom? And the people at the top are going to have everything, and the people at the bottom will have nothing. We can look at our U.S. Census every 10 years and see that the people at the top are getting more, the people at the bottom are getting less. We do it with children. So there's always a political struggle in terms of cultural groups. Let's talk about our households and our children. Children are some of they'll be the last people to be free. Now, I'm not a person that believes that children should be able to do everything that they want to do, but very often they are extremely oppressed in our homes. For example, when I was growing up, I never got to choose my clothes. My mom picked out my clothes every single day. She picked out my shoes, my socks, the dress. She did what she wanted to do with my hair. I had no choice until basically when I was 15, I started making my own clothes. But they still had to be in order with what she thought was appropriate. When I raised my sons, um, when they were very young, I would let them dress themselves to go to kindergarten and first grade. Now, sometimes my son would come out, one would come out in plaids and stripes, and another would come out with purple and a green. Most of us would say, oh, go back, change your clothes, get them to match. But why should they? They are expressing themselves with their clothing, and they can learn about matching as they get older. But they're pretty much oppressed. So there's always that power struggle. We teach our babies to let anybody touch them, and if somebody wants to hold them that the baby doesn't like, we tell the baby, "Oh, it's okay," blah blah blah. We don't do human beings like that, or grown-ups like that. Grown-ups can choose who they want to hold them and touch them, but children can't. So we every level of society is oppressed in some way. And I say even at the top. Look at all of our movies. When there's a disaster, who not only gets the privilege bringing a solution, but who has to go out and give their lives? It used to be white men. It used to be that nobody else could save the world but white men. And boy, is that a burden? I would think so. Now we understand that we all need to get together to save the world. And it's not for just the people at the top or just whites or just men. It's for all of us. So all of us carry a burden to some extent. So we start out with fear, then we'll go to subjugation. If that doesn't work, we'll go to genocide. So we see in families, especially early on, that many women were killed. Children were killed. And unfortunately, we're seeing that again today in high numbers. We commit genocide, and then if the people survive that, we may go to assimilation, etc., and so forth. But it tends to be violent whenever we come to people who are different culturally from us. Now, let's go on to a third point. This violence comes from how we evaluate different cultures. Point 3, how we evaluate different cultures. From the beginning, human beings have evaluated cultures differently, and I would say for survival purposes. We had to understand who was dangerous, who was not dangerous. We had even to our survival with food. You got to know which foods are safe to eat, which foods are not safe to eat, which animals can we live with, which animals are unsafe, what dirt is beneficial for us, what dirt and soil is not. So that is a survival instinct to make differences between what's bad and what's good. That's how we survived. However, I think we've come beyond that, and we can't necessarily group people by who's good and who's bad. The way that we evaluate cultures can be in many ways, but the first one is absolutism. Those people have to be exactly like us or we don't like them. Absolutism. There are certain ways that people should live. A second one is relativity, and that tends to be the most useful because we have to see that what other people do in their culture is different from us, but it may be appropriate. It's appropriate for them in their culture. So relativity, and the last one is universalism. Universalism suggests that there are certain things that we're going to look for in every culture. That even though it may be inappropriate in one culture to treat children in one way, in another culture it may be seen as appropriate. So those are the ways that we evaluate, and therefore we discriminate or help people who are in our in-group. Let's go on to our last point, which is how can we become responsible members in a multicultural society? Because we are here, we're not going anywhere, it's not going to change, it's going to become more diverse. The second thing is assume that you will be respectful to every person you meet, no matter what their race, no matter what their age. Very often we're disrespectful to teens, we're disrespectful to children, we're disrespectful to the elderly, disrespectful for people that we think come from other countries. Assume that everybody deserves respect. Secondly, reduce Fear. We're not at the caveman stage anymore, where being fearful helps to protect us. We need to understand that we don't have to be afraid of something because it's different. We don't have to be afraid of people because they're different and assume that they're bad. The second one is to live so that we help develop the potential of everybody in society. We become a better society. We're able to live our best life when we can help each person to reach their potential, because then everybody is contributing to society. We need to learn about cultures in this country, not just other people's. Start with yourself. What do you know about your culture? I study African American culture, and I've been doing it since I was 18. I continue to read. I read different books just to learn more about who I am, and then learn about other cultures. When you know who you are, when you value your culture, then you can value somebody else's culture, and you're not threatened. Lastly, we want to develop what's called cultural competence. Believe it or not, many jobs will ask for cultural competence, and that is, what skills do you have? What knowledge do you have? What capabilities do you have that will enable you to live in a diverse society? So I suggest that you embrace diversity and foster justice for all, because anyone who is considered is treated unjustly um, denigrates the entire society. I'm kind of paraphrasing Dr. King, but we need to foster social justice. So as I conclude, I want to say that cultures develop to meet the people's needs. We meet them many times in the same way, but sometimes differently. And remember that preserving your culture does not mean that we have to destroy other people's culture. It means that we can have fun and learn from each other. So don't fear and explore, embrace. That brings our talk today to an end. I'm hoping that you learned a lot from this and will be more relaxed about seeing people who are different. This is Dr. B, and I'm tuning out with Mr. Spock's favorite words: live long and prosper.